I think it's fair to say that every Championship club has made at least one mistake this season, and that's what we're going to be discussing in today's video. What's been the one thing to crop up throughout the year that you'll look back on at the end of the season and go, do you know what, if we'd have done that differently, we could have finished a little bit higher. That's what we're going to be discussing in today's video. If you do go to enjoy, make sure to leave a like. I'd love to get your suggestions on this one down below as well. But without any further ado, let's hop into it. With Birmingham, I'm going to say messing about with Lee Bowyer at the start of the season and not hiring John Eustace until the 3rd of July. A lot of external factors were playing a part in this, but we didn't know at the start of the season whether Bowyer was going, whether they were keeping him on because of the ongoing ownership issue, and ultimately not getting Eustace in until early July ultimately meant that he didn't have the time to properly get his feet under the table by the time the season had started. I do think that that had a little bit of a consequence on them by the way of how slow they actually started this season. You know, they only won one of their first 7 Championship matches. By the time that Eustace had figured things out, they slowly started to rise up the league table, but it just feels like if he was settled in place a little bit earlier, I think they started a little bit stronger and as a result have more points on the board right now. Blackburn, could you argue that not cashing in on Brereton Diaz was a mistake given the way his form's tailed off in this second half of the season? Because let's face it, his head is elsewhere. Was that now a mistake? You know, the fact that in the summer transfer window could have easily got, you know, maybe 10, 15 million for him if they were to put him out on the market, but they were very much sticking to their guns, not letting him go for less than they deemed acceptable. But ultimately, he will be walking away now on a free transfer at the end of the season. It just feels like had they maybe cashed on him and reinvested that money elsewhere in the squad, maybe they'd be in a little bit of a stronger situation right now. But that is looking back on this with hindsight. Blackpool's biggest mistake of the season, I think hiring Mick McCarthy. If we take into consideration that they were by no means cut adrift or anything while Appleton was in charge. Yes, they were on a bad run, but they were still very much in and competing around the sides at the bottom of the table. It just felt like McCarthy was a little bit of a strange appointment when you look at that Blackpool squad and the strengths of it, some of the technical players they have, how well we all thought they did in the January transfer window as well to get in some quite high quality loanees. Just doesn't feel like that is a squad geared to a manager like Mick McCarthy, and ultimately his tenure at the club has just turned out to be a little bit of a disaster with the results. With Bristol City, I'm going to say it was a mistake the way they handled the Hando Masengo situation. I get there's two sides to this story, and Masengo maybe was looking for that move away from the club, but the position that Pearson took on this one to just sort of straight away outcast him from the group, it did seem a little bit strange from the outside looking in, because whenever I've seen him play, I mean, he's run rings around Preston in the past, and I think that at his age, his pedigree as well, it's such a shame how his Bristol City career has just sort of fizzled out really, obviously out on loan now, but I just feel like if handled in a different situation, we could have got at least one more year of Masengo dazzling in the Championship, and if not, maybe sold on for a little bit of a profit, whereas now he'll just walk away for free. With Burnley, it's hard to find a mistake, but I'll go with the signing of Scott Twine. Perhaps with the money they've spent on him compared to the return they've got so far, they've not exactly got value there. And I mean, Burnley absolutely smashed it in both transfer windows really, and this is the obvious outlier in that. His injury record obviously hasn't helped him in this situation, but just feels like he's not quite been able to adapt to this Vincent Kompany side because of that, and other players as a consequence have overtaken him in the squad. He has had one or two moments, that free kick he scored at Turf Moor being the best of them, but overall it's just not been a signing that's worked out, and in a Burnley squad who's just been thriving this year, it just feels as if he's sort of been left behind. Cardiff's biggest mistake, I feel like, was sacking Morrison only to then appoint Mark Hudson. Seems strange at the time and still does looking back on it. If they were to have got rid of Morrison when they did and then hired Sabri Lamouchi, would have totally got that, but the whole debacle with Morrison leaving in the fashion he did, then replaced by Hudson, was a very strange time in their season. They didn't get a bounce whatsoever in terms of the results. They actually regressed a little bit under Hudson and fell further down to the relegation battle. But yeah, that was a strange point in Cardiff's season and a mistake, I'd say, looking back on it. Coventry's biggest mistake, it had to be at the start of the season. The whole debacle they were having with the stadium and postponing matches at home, and how slowly they actually started the league campaign as a consequence of that, just winning one of their opening 10 championship matches. Simon Moore was having an absolute nightmare in net for Coventry, and those first 10 matches or so will be the games that Coventry fans look back on at the end of the season and think, if we'd have started as competitively as we finished this season, who knows what could have been possible. Huddersfield's biggest mistakes had to be the appointments of Danny Schofield and Mark Fotheringham. There wasn't a lot of hope, I don't think, from outsiders with Schofield at the start of the season, and Fotheringham just seemed to rub up fans the wrong way after that. But we've seen what Warnock's been able to get out of this group of players compared to those previous two managers, and it just felt like, had they had the right man in place from minute one, where would they be right now in the Championship? Hull City's biggest mistake, probably not hiring Liam Rosenior earlier. I think there was a whole month in between them parting ways with Arveladze and then hiring Rosenior. There was the whole month of October between those two decisions, which, you know, it rumbled on for quite some time, but we've seen what Rosenior's been able to get out of this squad so far, and maybe, you know, what was even possible had a manager like him been in place from the start of the season. Luton have been pretty flawless this season, but their biggest mistake had to be away at Vicarage Road. The manner in which they just fell apart in that game against Watford, their arch rivals beating them 4-0 in the end, and I mean, ultimately Luton have gone on to have a far superior season to Watford, but that result away still has to sting shortly. Middlesbrough's biggest mistake of the season, probably persisting with Chris Wilder for as long as they did. They left it until October to make a decision and finally part ways with him and then bring in Michael Carrick. Another situation, because of how slow and turgid they were at the start of the season, surprisingly under Wilder, where it feels like what could have been had Carrick been instilled there from the start of the season, and how many points right now would they be better off because of that? Millwall have been pretty consistent throughout the whole season. The biggest mistake they've had, probably a bit of a slow start to the season. They lost 4 of their first 7 matches. On game week 9 they were as low as 19th in the Championship, but from that point they've just steadily grown up the table and have been a regular since then in the top 6. But those first few games at the start of the season didn't quite feel like they had their act together for whatever reason, whether that's something to do with pre-season or something going on behind the scenes at that time. Norwich City, the end of the Dean Smith era has to go down as the mistake, and maybe not parting ways with him sooner. Ultimately, they only won 3 of Smith's last 13 matches in charge, and we forget just how poor things actually were at Carrow Road towards the end of his tenure, considering all the talent that's within that squad right there, and the way we've sort of seen them progress, generally speaking, certainly in terms of performances under Wagner as well. Towards the end was just a little bit of a mess all round. Preston's biggest mistake, I'd say not signing another striker in the summer transfer window. Had we signed Tom Cannon, for example, in the summer when the fans were begging for another striker to come in, who knows where we'd be right now. The consecutive goalless draws that we had at the start of the season could have been ironed out with, you know, a few 1 and 2-0s in there had we got another striker target over the line. It just felt like we were reluctant to really push the boat in the summer transfer window, and we sort of had to make amends for that in January, which we have done, you know, with the signing of Cannon, who's been excellent, but that does feel like a bit of a regret, especially with those goalless draws at the start of the season. QPR's biggest mistake of the season, pretty much every decision they've made since Beale's left the club has been an absolute disaster on all fronts, whether that's managerial hirings, the lack of bounce they've got from either Critchley or Ainsworth, the recruitment, which was a little bit of a shambles in the January window as well, considering the drop-off in form they'd experienced, the fact they didn't bring in another striker target and they left themselves short in that squad in so many areas. They've left themselves with an unbalanced squad who doesn't fit the current manager. So many mistakes at QPR, I could probably do a full video on it. Biggest mistake by Reading, we have to point to the behind the scenes issues, which have ultimately landed them with a 6-point deduction and landed them in massive trouble and really sucked them back into this relegation zone. Been a really weird season from a Reading fan's perspective, I'm sure, with them starting against the odds fairly well, but how much they've actually regressed from that point. Unlike some of their other seasons in the Championship, I actually think that Rotherham have made a lot of good decisions this season. Really positive January transfer window in the end, keeping their head above water in terms of the bottom three as well. If I had to point out a mistake, maybe not handling some of the contracts for some of their stars at the club sooner. So I'm talking about, obviously, Ogbeni. That contract situation's been rambling on for quite some time. Could they have got something in the pipeline for him a little bit earlier on? Maybe. Obviously, they were sort of forced into selling Barlays because of a similar contract situation as well, but I am picking at things there. They have been very good on the whole, Rotherham. Sheffield United's biggest mistake of the season, probably the form from around February to March time, where everything just seemed to be a little bit rocky. From that up until that point, everything had been quite smooth sailing for the Blades, and they're another club who it's hard to pick out an obvious flaw in their season because they are second in the Championship at the moment, but that spell from February to March especially, where Middlesbrough made up some serious ground on them and, you know, particularly narrowed the gap at that point, that was a little bit of a wobble where a series of mistakes were being made on the pitch. Stoke City, I think we can probably pick some gaps with their summer recruitment, given how much they've elevated the squad with the additions they made in January. Had they made those additions earlier on, you know, in the summer, where would this Stoke squad be right now? And it's hard to say because Alex Neil wasn't in place at Stoke at the start of the season, so it's hard, you know, for them to have forward planned that sort of thing. But generally speaking, it didn't seem like their summer recruitment was totally up to scratch considering the deals they did in January. Speaking of recruitment, I think that's probably what we're going to point out was Sunderland's biggest mistake of the season, and not signing another striker target in the January transfer window, with Sims being recalled and then Ross Stewart picking up that season-ending injury. It felt like they just left themselves particularly short with a natural number 9, and had they got another deal over the line alongside Geldhart, who knows where they'd be right now. Swansea's biggest mistake of the season probably falls into recruitment as well. It was two quite underwhelming windows overall from Swansea. January really didn't help things. I remember going over each Championship club's January transfer window. I think we ranked Swansea the lowest at that point, and overall it just feels like this season has been a little bit of an opportunity missed for this Swansea side, who felt like at the end of last season were on the cusp of achieving something. With Watford, I think it's the whole club strategy which has been a massive mistake this season. The quick hiring and firing of managers, putting Rob Edwards in place at the start of the season but not fully backing him with the squad that was suited to him, quickly disregarding him. He then goes to your arch rivals, gets them firing, then the hiring of Bilic, that doesn't go to plan, quickly part ways with him, then you bring Wilder in, and it just feels like a mismatch of managers with a mismatched squad, and all the decisions leading up to that behind the scenes have just been so many mistakes behind that. West Brom's obvious two mistakes for me have to be starting the season with Steve Bruce in the dugout and David Button in net, and those two things cost West Brom a hell of a lot of points at the start of the season. The whole Bruce appointment at West Brom was baffling to me to begin with, to be honest. I was really surprised they were willing to give him the start of this season after how poorly I thought last season had gone for him, but they went ahead and did so, started the season awfully, and since getting rid of him and dropping Button as the number 1, they've been a lot better. With Wigan, I think recruitment has been the big mistake this season. They've definitely left themselves short in terms of Championship quality, but their biggest mistake had to be, for me, parting ways with Richardson when they did, to only bring in Kolo Touré. And looking back on his spell as Wigan manager now, however short it was, I mean, that was nothing short of an absolute disaster. The rate at which they were conceding goals under Touré, their goal difference took an absolute tanking during that time, and maybe had they brought in Maloney at that point instead of bringing in Touré, they'd been in a different situation now. But that whole spell was entertaining but thoroughly bad for Wigan. But guys, there we have it. That will now wrap it up for today's video. There was one mistake I believe each Championship club has made this season. Do you agree with me, and what for you has been the biggest mistake your club has made? Do let me know down below. Apart from that though guys, that will now wrap it up for today's video. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I'll see you all in the next one.